Hello again, everyone. This is Fred, and today I'm going to pick up the topic of sermon outlining again. And I've given you the basic pieces, the foundational building blocks in the previous session. And now in this session, I'm going to talk about the actual outline itself. And I'm going to begin with a basic outline. And then in the next number of sessions, I'm going to give you some varieties of outline that adhere to the basic structure, but give us some little nuances in terms of how to unfold and structure a sermon. So I'm just going to hold this up real close, real quick. So what I've got here, and you'll have this in your handouts, is the basic structure, and it goes like this. So you've got your text, then you've got an outline, an introduction. Then there's an opportunity to give the context of the book, when it was originally written and to whom and why. And then there's a transition from that into the main point, main point number one. And as I say right here, your main point is always a complete sentence. It should not be a word or a fragment or a phrase. It should be a complete sentence. The reason for that is it gives clarity to you, the preacher. And then we have subpoints. And the subpoints may have further detail and explanation. And then another subpoint would be what we will call support material, an illustration, a quote, a statistic, for example, or a personal experience. And then there's a transition statement to our next major point. And it's helpful to think of these points as moves rather than just points, because the idea of a point seems to be, it's kind of self-contained, where the idea of a move is something has happened before this and something is going to happen after this, and we're going somewhere. We're making a journey in this passage and in this sermon. So I really like the idea of moves when it comes to sermon points. Maybe 20, 25 years ago now, David Buttrick, I think he was teaching at Vanderbilt University at the time, wrote a very thick book on preaching called Homiletic Moves and Structures. And it's a tough read, but he came up with this idea of preaching moves. And I know Dr. Robinson likes that concept as well. Okay, so then we go to point number 2, Roman numeral number 2. And I'm just going to say a word here about formatting and your outline. I like to put my main points in a large font and maybe capitalize every word, and sometimes I'll bold that main point so it's really easy to see. And I have a lot of white space on my outline, so it's not cluttered, it's not hard to read. So the second main point or move is then put forward. It's a similar structure to that. And one of the subpoints I've put in here is look for cultural connections. Cultural connections. What's going on in the news, in politics, in economics, the coronavirus, environmentally, any tragedies in the world around, earthquakes, hurricanes, major books that have been written, movies. Are there some points of cultural connectivity? That's always really good for your sermon and connecting with your audience. So then we go to third point, main point or main move number 3. And I put a little hint in here on the handout, and the hint basically says this. As we move through the outline, we want to maintain a measure of tension. And by that I mean, I still have questions, or I don't completely understand, or how is this going to resolve? If I don't have tension in the sermon, then the listeners don't need to listen. Everything has been resolved. Now, sometimes what happens with preachers is we like to avoid tension. But I want to convince you and encourage you to say, tension is your best friend. And so, for example, when you see tension in the biblical text, take advantage of it. So, for example, Luke 19, Jesus and Zacchaeus. You know, Zacchaeus is a tax collector and he's corrupt. Well, he's kind of greedy. Money is his God. Now, instead of maybe just glancing over that and rushing past all of that, slow down and talk about that, because there's a cultural connectivity moment right there. But in order to catch it, you've got to be comfortable talking about greed. You've got to be comfortable talking about, the God of money, and how Zacchaeus and many other people have kind of sold themselves out for these false gods. When you're talking about a passage where, for example, here's another one, James 5. In James 5, it's a passage about healing. And it says the most maybe controversial verse, I would say, is, I think it's verse 15, where it says, the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise him up. Now, look for tension. And it's pretty easy to find here. And the tension comes from the fact that many, many people, good, godly Christians, are not healed. Eventually we all die. We know that. So healing is not an ultimate answer. It's an interim answer. So how do we deal with the issue of when people are not healed? Now, that's a point of tension. It's a point of controversy. And we might like to avoid it. But I would say your sermon will be much, much more interesting if you deal with the tension. Okay, now let's move on. After we have our major moves or points, and listen, there may be more than 3. There may be 5. There may be 7. So don't be restricted. Let the text dictate how many points there should be. Then we go to application. Now, application is the so what section of your sermon. Now, let me pause to say, application can be made inside of the main points, and it can also be made at the conclusion of the main points and near the end of the sermon. But here's a couple of things I'd like to say. Don't shrink or shortcut the application. Give good, adequate attention and time to application. And make that application practical, not abstract, but practical. Practical application is key. And please don't do this. Please do not make application in the introduction. I think a lot of preachers fall into this trap. But I would suggest, please do not make application in the introduction, because you haven't even opened your text yet. You haven't explained or unpacked the passage yet. So you're not ready. Your listeners are not ready for application yet. Application has to build on the theology embedded in the text. So please keep that in mind. And again, I'll just want to say, make sure your application is practical and not abstract. Specific and not general. Specific has more power and more impact. Practical has more impact and more power than abstract. So make it real, make it concrete for people. And then the next thing I want to say about the outline here is insert into your outline 3, 4, even 5 places where you are going to you're going to state your big idea. Repeat your big idea 3, 4, 5 times. And then repeat it again right at the very end. And that will help your big idea to stick and to be memorized and remembered by your listeners. Okay, so that's the general structure of the outline. And in the next session, I'm going to get into a number of particular types of outlines, all kind of built on this basic one. But as you'll see in the next number of videos, there are some varieties that we can employ. Okay, take care. Hope this was helpful to you.